Hey guys, this is Jimmy back at you with another video once again for you guys today. So, kicking off 2021, it's that time of the year again. The Royal Rumble's just around the corner, so I just figured why not come up on here and conduct a series of reviews regarding some of the past Royal Rumble events that have taken place over the years. So, I'm just going to review a handful of Royal Rumble shows. I'm not going to review every single Royal Rumble event from the very first one over to the most recent. This is just going to coincide with the festivities, especially since being that every January is the Royal Rumble. So I just kind of want to come up on here and to kind of conduct some series of reviews and thoughts pertaining to some of these events. I'm going to be reviewing the Royal Rumble of 1995. The show was held at the USF Sun Dome in Tampa, Florida. So we're in the middle of the new generation era. So by this point, a lot of the top tier stars of the rock and wrestling era have either retired or have moved over to another rival wrestling organization. It's such a big transition period, especially by the time the mid-90s rolled around and the business was steadily declining. And going back to what I was saying, a lot of the top superstars had either retired or had left the WWF to venture out to other projects or venturing out to another wrestling organization, in that case being WCW, where notable superstars like Hulk Hogan, Macho Man Randy Savage, all those folks have gone on to the other competition. And over in the WWF, you had Bret Hart, who was really coming into his own at this point, and he had been a multiple time WWF champion at this point. Along with that, you had guys like The Undertaker, Razor Ramon, Big Daddy Cool Diesel, who had just won the WWF title not too long prior to this. He didn't really have a lot of those larger-than-life type of characters that dominated during the initial boom period of the WWF. And, gone were the days of the muscle-bounded wrestlers, and now you're kind of leaning more towards an emphasis on in-ring work and the athleticism. And Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels, Razor Ramon, and 1-2-3 Kid, all these superstars that defined a new generation era kind of symbolically represented that sort of new direction that the company was going through. Some of the tropes that really defined 80s wrestling would be carried over in the new generation with its kid-friendly image, and you had a lot of these like very zany, cartoony gimmicks like the Doink the Clowns or the Duke the Dumpster Drozy. Even later in the year in 1995 with Dr. Isaac Yankem, like this part-time dentist who happens to be a wrestler as well. And even have like Jeff Jarrett, who was like this part-time country singer that's wrestling in the World Wrestling Federation. It's like all these really zany gimmicks where it's like they have some kind of job outside of WWF. And it was just so weird in a sense. And, even though the business wasn't necessarily doing so hot during this time, but, 95 is regarded as one of the worst years for the company, both financially and in terms of like the quality. For Royal Rumble 1995, this is not one of the worst pay-per-views. It's actually I would say it was actually quite enjoyable for what it was. And for new generation standards, it was pretty spectacular in a sense. And there was actually a handful of good matches, especially on the undercard side of things. You did have the 30-man Royal Rumble match, which is the selling point of the pay-per-view. I'll get a little more into the Royal Rumble match as the video rolls along. But the undercard was miraculously impressive, I will say. Now, we did have the first match that opened up the show, which happens to be Razor Ramon going in as the Intercontinental Champion, defending the belt against Jeff Jarrett. So this was basically a very competitive match. This match saw Jeff Jarrett just working on the leg of Razor. And there were some occasions where Razor got a bit of offense here with the signature choke slam. Jeff Jarrett doing an impressive enziguri on the Ramone. Rhodey, who we all know as the Road Dogg many years later, would be Jeff Jarrett's manager. So it's very interesting just to see Road Dogg, especially in this gimmick and how goofy it was. But, eventually he would go on to be a much bigger star, especially in the tag team division with Billy Gunn, with New Age Outlaws, and eventually becoming a member of the most influential wrestling stables of all time, being D-Generation X. Jeff Jarrett was embracing that country singer persona as well. He's gotten Razor Ramon's number, and Razor had been champion since SummerSlam 94, having won the belt from Diesel. So he'd been holding that belt for quite some time now, and Royal Rumble approaches, so Razor's doing all he can to fight back. Being that this match, given how Jarrett had spent a good duration of it just working on the leg of Razor, it does play a big part as to him eventually losing the IC title. Initially, the match ended when Jeff Jarrett remained in the ring via countout, and while Razor Ramon was trying to get his way back in the ring, Rhodey used a chop block on Razor. The referee is making that slow 10 count, and because Razor's leg, being that Razor would be unable to get back in the ring on time, so therefore the match would be, with Jeff Jarrett being the only person standing in the ring, being declared the winner. So he wins the match, but since the title can't change hands by disqualification or countout, so Razor would still be the champion. But then Jeff Jarrett got on the mic and just basically was unsatisfied by the end result of it and insists that the match should be restarted, that Razor should get back in the ring. And Jarrett's a heel, so it's very interesting even in that scenario, because normally when a match ends in countout, a lot of the times it's the heel that walks out of the match. But here, this was like one of the rare times, especially in WWE, where the babyface would lose by countout. Jarrett, despite being the heel that he is, he's completely unsatisfied by the result. So it kind of really puts over Jarrett. It's even though he could be this cowardly heel at times, but there are occasions where he feels in this case, the Intercontinental title is on the line. I can't win the belt if it's by countout, so I insist, let's insist on restarting the match and have me beat Razor in the middle of the ring to win my Intercontinental title. Eventually the match restarts, and they're going back and forth at it, and Razor does fight back and eventually tries to hit the Razor's edge, but due to his bagged leg, his leg gives out on him, so he's unable to perform his finisher, thus allowing Jarrett to take advantage, rolls up Razor for the 3 count in order to become the new Intercontinental champion. So I definitely really loved this match, and the crowd was really hot for most of the night, but this was a really smart way to open up the show. And Razor was very, very, well, it's breezily over, I will say. And he'd been a fixture in the IC title picture for most of 94 and even going into early 95. And eventually this title reign would end with Jeff Jarrett coming out on top. Now they would eventually have the rematch a couple months later at WrestleMania, and Jarrett would still retain the title for the next several months up until losing it to Shawn Michaels at the July In Your House pay-per-view. It's one of those hidden gems, especially if we're talking new generation era matches that doesn't involve Bret or Shawn. This was definitely a very impressive match. I mean, Jeff Jarrett's a pretty good worker. I don't think he's the be-all, end-all as he tends to be at times. Especially by the time he got to WCW, he ended up getting this massive push in the main event scene and winning the world title on a number of occasions, and especially in TNA as well. Not denying all his credentials and his in-ring ability, but he's still a really good worker. I'm just saying that, it's not in a way where he believes in his own hype. But yeah, I mean, still, nevertheless, this was a really tremendous match, and I would definitely recommend you go out your way and seeing it. And so we transition over to the next match between The Undertaker taking on IRS. So IRS, being a member of the $1 Million Corporation, which is a stable led by Ted DiBiase, who he, along with IRS, were formerly a tag team known as Money Incorporated. But by this point, Ted DiBiase had retired from in-ring wrestling after years of neck complications. So he's sort of a manager to IRS. This was in the midst of Undertaker's program with the $1 Million Corporation, which was a huge feud that was going on in late 94 and especially in 95 as well. And Undertaker had to deal with his doppelganger at SummerSlam and then exacting his revenge against Yokozuna a couple months later at Survivor Series. And so Taker sets his eyes back on the $1 Million Corporation once again. This was a very uneventful match, very forgettable. You did have some interference from the Druids who showed up during the match. And so they're doing all they can to wear out The Undertaker. You know, IRS doing everything he can to thwart off The Undertaker. There were times where Taker tried to go for a tombstone, but, you know, IRS would either counter that or the Druids would, you know, interfere and prevent Undertaker from gaining any sort of like dominance whatsoever. Eventually, The Undertaker does go over with the chokeslam to IRS in order to secure a victory. The chokeslam that IRS sold seemed to be a bit sloppy, even watching that again. This was just kind of a way to set up Undertaker's program with King Kong Bundy. You know, King Kong Bundy would become a member of the $1 Million Corporation, and they would have that match at WrestleMania 11. This was definitely like the step down from the previous match and easily the worst match of the night. But yeah, just very forgettable at best. But then we get to the bright side of things. So kind of moving on. This match was given a lot of time and almost went about half an hour, hard to believe. And this happens to be the world title match between the champion Diesel defending the belt against Bret Hart. And Diesel, going back to what I was saying, like he won the world title not too long prior to this. He actually won the belt from Bob Backlund on a house show circuit. It was like a little after Survivor Series that Bob Backlund won the belt from Bret Hart. And so this was like an untelevised event, and Diesel surprisingly beat Bob Backlund in 8 seconds and winning the WWF title for the first time. Given the circumstances, so Bret Hart is given this rematch to potentially reclaim his WWF title. So he gets to face the new champion Diesel, and they're kind of going at it one-on-one. And this was just such a clinic of a match. Bret Hart mostly playing all the offense. And it's very similar to how the IC title match from earlier played out. Like what Jeff Jarrett did in working on the leg of Razor, because his finisher was like the figure 4 leg lock. And so Bret Hart kind of takes cues from that, and being that his finisher is the sharpshooter. So he's working on the leg of Diesel throughout most of the match, and he's got most of the offense early on. Diesel does fight back eventually, and there were some moments where I believe Bret Hart used some kind of like red cable cord, and he wraps it all around the feet of Diesel. And it looked like for a moment he was going to go for his traditional figure 4 leg lock on the apron, you know, like the one that he normally does, especially at a time when he did that to Stone Cold a year or two later. So I thought watching that for the first time he was going to go for that figure 4, but he didn't. But he does utilize Diesel's leg to his advantage, utilizing that in-ring psychology. That plays a theme throughout most of this match. Diesel does fight back, and he nails Bret Hart with a jackknife powerbomb. And so he goes for a cover, but then Shawn Michaels interferes and stops the count. Due to the circumstances, like the match was initially paused for a moment until, being that Earl Hebner was officiating this match, so he insisted to the ring announcer, being the late Howard Finkel, to restart the match. And that was actually one thing I was very surprised as well, because like even like traditional wrestling matches, like especially when like a wrestler were to interfere and, you know, the referee would call for the bell, that match would automatically be over. It would have been like disqualification right then and there, at least in like modern WWE. But this was like one of those rare moments in the company's history where the match had to be restarted. Like you're actually watching like a legit sport. So the match does restart, and Bret and Diesel are going at it once again. There was actually a moment where I believe Bret Hart hit the exposed turnbuckle, or it was like it was eventually Bret and Diesel. There were moments where they did both landed hard on the exposed ring turnbuckle, like the turnbuckle pad was like removed. So eventually it got to a point where Bret and Diesel were utilizing the exposed turnbuckle to their advantage. And so it was like a lot of near falls as well. So this was definitely like a marathon of a match. Bret Hart's got the sharpshooter. Owen Hart comes out and stops the submission hold. And then, then Earl had to ring the bell once again. And then the match restarts for a second time. And so Owen and Shawn were both sent to the back, but even despite that, they would eventually come back. They would also gang up on Diesel and Bret in unison, but also with Bob Backlund, considering their program with Bret Hart at the time, and Shawn would also come out and given his dissension with Diesel. So they were the former tag team champions. So Diesel and Shawn are kind of at each other's throats at this point. This was a great match. I know it does get a little bit of criticism based on the ending of the match. And, given how there wasn't a decisive victor. Despite all that, this was still a very incredible match. And Diesel and Bret would eventually rekindle their program by the end of the year at Survivor Series, where they had that no holds barred match with, basically anything goes. And, no disqualification. There must be a winner. Yeah, all the Bret and Diesel matches, this was definitely one of the really good ones. And I know they actually had one at King of the Ring just a couple months prior to this, so it's kind of interesting that this and King of the Ring, where their matches ended in some kind of disqualification or no finishes. So this was actually very interesting. But this is basically sort of like a storyline advancement angle to further set up feuds for Diesel and Bret to face other wrestlers that they were already having their personal score to settle with. That's basically what this match was designed. Nowadays, when they do these kind of matches, they would end up saving that for like the next pay-per-view, and they would do a rematch like right out the bat. But back in the new generation, there weren't really a lot of pay-per-views. Now they would introduce the In Your House concept many months later. But back in these days, they didn't really have as many pay-per-views as you do now, just the big four pay-per-views. I mean, it took a long, long time for Bret Hart and Diesel to square off in the middle of the ring again. So it does make that kind of, that grudge match seem even more like, like a big deal. And so, not like, the later years where it seems like once you started introducing all these new pay-per-views, you would have like a pay-per-view like the following month, and then Bret and Diesel would feud like, 1 month after. But in this case, you had to wait a really long time for them to square off. So that's kind of how it was during the New Generation era. Despite the finish, I mean, this was definitely a very incredible match. So then we get to... this is actually very interesting because I didn't think that there would be a match that would follow up Diesel and Bret, given how incredible that match was. And, and given the next match that preceded it, being the tournament final for the vacated tag team championships. And surprisingly, this match, being that Diesel and Shawn had been the tag team champions, so eventually, they had their dissension going on at Survivor Series, and they were still champions. Like, Shawn Michaels super kicked Diesel, and then they had their little riff. And it got to the point where they had no choice but to strip Diesel and Shawn out of the tag team title belts. So there would be a tournament that would be contested in weeks' time to determine the new World Tag Team Champions. So eventually you would have it at the Royal Rumble where the finals would take place. The 1, 2, 3 kid, who we all know as X-Pac, along with Sparkplug Holly, who we all know as Hardcore Holly many years later. So they're taking on the $1 Million Corporation members of Bam Bam Bigelow and Tatanka. Yeah, like I said, this match, I didn't think it would follow up on Bret and Diesel as amazing of a match that had every right to be. They didn't give it as much time like Bret and Diesel, but it was given a pretty sufficient amount of time, especially for a match that didn't involve the world title or that wasn't a Royal Rumble match. But yeah, this was definitely very competitive as well. The Kid and Bob Holly were a very amazing thrown in together tag team. You know, they're facing like the powerhouse brute that was Bam Bam and Tatanka. Tatanka had sold his soul to the $1 Million Corporation earlier that summer. And, you know, Bam Bam Bigelow had been a member of the corporation since the very beginning. Bam Bam Tatanka getting all the offense. Kid and Bob Holly being the underdogs that they are, just doing everything that they can to keep on fighting. You know, every time that they get knocked down, they just keep getting back up. It's one of those matches where you just have to see it for yourself. I'm sadly not going to go into detail regarding about which spots that they did. This also played a big part because dissension kind of implodes between Bam Bam and Tatanka, and their kind of miscommunication caused them to lose the match and allowing the Kid and Holly to be awarded the new World Tag Team Champions. So after the match, Bam Bam got into a scuffle with NFL player Lawrence Taylor, and he was in attendance. He was sitting front row, and so they kind of get into a scuffle, and there's just a lot of that going on, and you know, officials come in to kind of break them up. So that kind of advances their match that they would eventually have at WrestleMania 11. So definitely a really good match. It's a shame Bam Bam Bigelow's no longer with us. He was definitely a really talented worker. I mean, that could have done a lot more in WWF, but things didn't work out. And eventually falling victim to the Clique at this time, so he would go on to have his success in ECW and even WCW to a degree as well. Nevertheless, just a really good match. And this would also kind of foreshadows Bam Bam being booted out of the $1 Million Corporation shortly after. And now we get to the main event, that being the 30-man Royal Rumble match. And like many Royal Rumble matches before and after this, the winner of that match would go on to headline WrestleMania and challenge for the World Wrestling Federation title. This was definitely one of those really peculiar Rumble matches, and this is like one of the shortest Royal Rumble matches to my knowledge. And if you look at the star power during this time, like going back to what I was saying at the very beginning of the video, it's like, you know, you didn't really have as much star power that you had like many years prior to this. And you look at like a roster in 92 with guys like Ric Flair, Hulk Hogan, Randy Savage, Ted DiBiase, Sid Vicious, Jake Roberts, and you know, the list goes on. And then you go from that to like Duke the Dumpster Droese and the Blue Brothers and Doink the Clown. It's like within those 3 years, it's almost like an entirely different company. And you did have like a few notable wrestlers in the match. You know, obviously, you know, with British Bulldog, Owen Hart, Shawn Michaels, considering like he was a big focal part throughout this match. And they had him start at number 1. So he outlasted 29 competitors in that match. And the intervals for the Royal Rumble match that year went from, I believe, like 2 minutes to like 60 seconds. I think it might have been like 90 seconds or 2 minutes, like in the past Rumble events before that. And then, you know, Rumble 95 came along, and then everything just kind of moved really, really fast. You know, on one hand, it's kind of understandable considering how depleted the roster was at the time. Aside from maybe like a few key important wrestlers, like everyone else was like either jobbers or they were just kind of in some, like either that or they're just kind of in limbo. Like they don't really have a direction, or they just don't have that kind of star power that certain other top tier wrestlers had. Like nobody talks about Quang or how he's going to win the 95 Rumble. But you did have Bob Backlund and King Kong Bundy. So that's really the only notable Lex Luger, I guess. But everyone else is just kind of, you know, like a lot of no-name guys that would be gone from the company within the next year, which is very astounding. If you look at the roster in 95 and then look at the roster in 96, I mean, it's just like, man, it was just such a big turnover, I guess, for lack of a better word. But yeah, the intervals were very quick. A lot of wrestlers were coming in and out. Shawn lasted, like I said, lasted out 29 competitors. British Bulldog also lasted from the beginning as well, being number 2, and he also lasted all the way to the end as well. We did have Bret Hart coming out there to attack Owen Hart. Owen Hart was trying to make his way in the ring when when the interval went 0, so he was going to come out, but Bret Hart attacked him. This Royal Rumble was very disappointing. One of the worst Rumbles. I know some folks will probably argue that there were other worse ones, like people bring up 2015's Rumble being the worst given the reception of the crowd reactions, especially the way it was being booked and how all their favorite wrestlers got eliminated. 99 Rumble was all over the place. 95 is definitely up there, I will say. I mean, especially for the lack of star power. I think the match lasted under 40 minutes. I'm looking at the timestamps, but yeah, it lasted like 38 minutes, 41 seconds. So that should tell you something. It was so sad just looking to see how fallen the roster was at that point. But I can't stress enough about that. So Shawn Michaels did win the 95 Rumble. He originally, it was believed that Bulldog eliminated Shawn because in a Rumble match both feet have to touch the floor in order to get eliminated, and Shawn's feet only touched the ground, only his foot landed on the ground. So eventually they didn't count Michaels' elimination. British Bulldog thought he won the match because now that his music's blasting in the background. So then, using that advantage, Bulldog gets carried away by the celebration. So it got to a point where Michaels took that advantage. He throws out Bulldog out of the ring and officially declaring himself the 1995 Royal Rumble winner. That was basically the Royal Rumble match there. It was definitely one of my least favorite Royal Rumble matches I've seen so far. I mean, just the depleted roster. And I will praise Shawn Michaels for outlasting all those wrestlers. And we wouldn't see that kind of feat being accomplished again until 2004 when Chris Benoit won the Royal Rumble at number 1. But, given the circumstances surrounding his death, so they don't tend to acknowledge Benoit's presence and his accomplishments. At that time, I mean, it was such a huge feat. It's just kind of weird, like Shawn Michaels was the heel, he's number 1, and he outlasted all those wrestlers, but they're making it seem like, why is the heel the freaking underdog? I mean, I can understand that if they had done that maybe like a year later, considering Shawn Michaels would win the Royal Rumble like 2 straight times in a row, especially this year's Rumble and then the next year's Rumble. But it would have been so fitting had they done that kind of concept the following year's Rumble when Shawn went face and he had to go number 1 and literally go through all 29 competitors. But it didn't make sense to me, even with Michaels as a heel. It just seems kind of odd that they would have the heel be the underdog. So he would go on to face Diesel in a losing effort, and then eventually would turn face shortly after, learning the error of his ways, and then patching things up with Diesel once again before Diesel ends up changing his new attitude. So they would end up rekindling their program before Nash would be on his way out to WCW. Royal Rumble 95, I mean, even despite 1995 being widely regarded as the worst year in the company's history, but this pay-per-view was not one of the prime examples. Royal Rumble 1995, I mean, very solid show overall. Thank you all guys for watching, and stay tuned for more Royal Rumble reviews down the road. And until next time, this is Jimmy signing out. Take care, everyone.